Bonjour et bienvenue à l'épisode 210 du podcast Innovation, Agilité et Excellence. Mon nom est Jean-François Nantel et en compagnie d'Éric Lheureux, nous désirons vous offrir réflexions, conseils et perspectives afin de faire face aux perturbations du marché et pour développer la croissance profitable et durable de vos organisations. Avec les tensions commerciales entre les États-Unis et le reste du monde à leur plus haut point depuis plusieurs décennies, nous ne pouvons pas nous empêcher d'aller voir ce que le professeur Stephen Blank a à dire sur ces sujets. Si je vous dis que le nationalisme québécois est à contre-courant du nationalisme canadien en ce qui a trait à cette notion d'espace économique nord-américain initialement créé dans les années 80, cela vous surprendrait-il? Ce n'est pas la seule surprise dans ce podcast avec un des plus grands experts en relations canado-américaines que nous vous invitons à écouter avec attention. Stephen Blank est un habitué de nos podcasts qui vit et travaille à New York. Il détient un baccalauréat de l'Université Dartmouth, des maîtrises des universités de Cambridge et de Harvard, ainsi qu'un PhD de l'Université de Harvard. Il est Senior Fellow de l'Institut sur la science, la recherche et les politiques publiques de l'Université d'Ottawa et Senior Fellow de l'Institut Macdonald-Laurier. Vous trouverez un résumé de sa très longue et passionnante carrière dans l'introduction à l'épisode 25, le premier des 7 épisodes réalisés avec lui. Bonne écoute! Hello, Professor Blank.
Jean-François, it's wonderful to see you again.
Professor Blank, now that the new Trump administration is almost all in place, I would like to discuss Canada-US relations with you, which is something you are well known as an expert. But before we go into the specifics of this special relationships, let's take things in sequence. What's motivating this all-out trade war on friends and foes alike? Is it just trade deficits?
I think President Trump, Mr. Trump, has only 2 words in his vocabulary: tariffs and migrants. More tariffs and fewer migrants, and everything gets better. He actually says, it's hard to imagine, that if we have enough tariffs, we don't have to pay income tax. If we get rid of migrants, we can get rid of every other problem. Those are the only 2 things he seems to know. And it's very hard to get a sense of anything like this. Someone must have read him a book about McKinley, the McKinley tariff. And if there's a president he is trying to imitate in terms of the aggressiveness and international behavior and tariff, it's McKinley. And this is a different world, a different situation. It makes no sense. I mean, there is no justification. I don't mean just a political, there's no intellectual justification for his tariff theory. It's not a theory, it's a passion, it's a megalomania. I have no idea. It doesn't make any sense. And it leads to a great deal of problems. I mean, so I have the slightest idea. He has some people around him who speak with the same tongue, but I think that's a kind of madness. God knows what they're drinking in the White House, what water they're... But if you followed him in the campaign, only 2 words: migrants are bad and tariffs are good. And if you had enough tariffs and fewer migrants, everything would work out happily. We'd all live happily ever after. It is a bizarre, and he's talking about manifest destiny. I mean, who has come up with those terms in a century? I mean, it really is. It is impressive where he lives intellectually.
Remember the 1970s and 1980s when cheap Japanese cars and motorcycles began entering the North American market? Is the current situation with Chinese electric vehicles similar, or are the Chinese playing a different script than Japan was in those 70s and 80s?
The Chinese have a remarkable resource comparable only to the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century. They have a huge mass, middle-class consuming market. So they are able to do with electric cars what Henry Ford did with Model Ts, have enough business that they could develop economies of scale. And knowing from the Japanese experience, you can make corrections online, the way the Japanese did it, rather than the way the U.S. did. So the Japanese have an advantage. Chinese have an advantage with EVs that we simply can't catch up with. we are still selling EVs as luxury automobiles, whereas they are selling them as commodities. And we'll never catch up. And the fact that they own the whole supply chain into batteries and such. What we did with the Japanese was very clever, I think. We told the Japanese not to export here, but to build cars here. And the American automobile industry competed with them on the ground. And U.S. cars got much, much better through the competition with the Japanese. I think, I'm a great fan in many ways of Bidenomics. I thought it was remarkable how he looks back to FDR more than any president since then. But I disagreed on emphasizing making EVs here. If we want EVs, if it's a big deal, we should bring in the Chinese. I have a hard time understanding all this fear that anything Chinese means the Chinese government is running it. I don't think that. But Mr. Trump apparently hates electric vehicles, except for one. He was advertising Tesla today. Everyone should buy $80,000 the car. He says he's going to buy one. He never driven a car in his life. But again, that's so bizarre. But if we want to have EVs, and they're very important in terms of green technology, which is again out of the world as far as Trump is concerned, I would have the Chinese come, and force the legacy people to compete with them. I mean, that's what we did with the Japanese. Whether we could go from ICEs, internal combustion engine, to EVs, even so, because you can go from U.S. cars to Japanese cars, it was the same basic thing. This is a different world. Mm-hmm. But I don't see how we could do it without. The other thing I would do, and the thing that was lost in the Biden program, a lot of money was allocated for research and development, which was never appropriated. I mean, there's no reason we should be talking about lithium batteries. That's an old world. We should look at sodium or oxygen batteries, and we should be trying to be out in front rather than trying to catch up. But that money was not appropriated even under Biden, and under Trump. Who knows what's going to happen? Everyone's going to be fired. When you're firing the people who fly the airplanes into the hurricanes, it's to get weather reports. I mean, then you really are pretty weird. So I don't know, but that's what that's what I would do. I would be looking the next step, and I would be building on what the Chinese do, because we're not going to be able to catch up. And anyway, that mass market in China is perhaps the most important geoeconomic development in the world history in 100 years, or at least since the war. That is a vital, consuming, huge market. If the Chinese government wasn't so stupid, they could build on that, in a remarkable way. But again, they have become stupid. But in any case, that's my answer to that. No.
So if I paraphrase you, force Chinese automakers to come to North America and build cars here or assemble cars here, keep some of the value add back in the home country, but build cars more adapted and assembled in the domestic market.
And we'd have to also get them to build charging centers, which of course we haven't been able to do. I mean, even under Biden, mm-hmm. they promised 80,000. He built 258 or something like that. I mean, that's the other thing has to be done, and they have to be reliable. I mean, which means your grid has to be reliable, and so. All those things, yes.
And we'll get to this grid thing a little bit later on. In a recent opinion piece in the New York Times, Robert E. Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative in the first Trump administration, says that tariffs should be an important part of a renewed trade system, distinguishing countries based on their political systems and trade balances, saying that countries running trade deficits are being ripped off by their partners, which is exactly what Trump is saying and is exactly what Trump is drinking at the White House. His premise is that the current trading system has failed the USA and other countries. Is this assumption, in your opinion, true, or have companies wishing to do business in China simply given their intellectual property away?
Well, okay, lots of different questions packed in there. One, the notion that trade deficits are, first of all, remember, in these people's minds, they're only talking about goods. They're not
Yes.
about services. The United States runs a significant trade surplus on services. Second, in the near future, a lot of trade is going to be in non-physical stuff. I mean, I don't like to use the example, but if you want to buy a gun kit to make a gun,
Yes.
you get a email, and you run that through your 3D printer. How would you? That is not physical. It's not service. It's not physical. A lot of stuff is going to be like that. So when you're talking about trade deficits, you better figure out services. You better look at the next wave of what this is going to be. You know, when you buy something from Amazon, you don't know where that click goes to, or where they send the thing from, or anything about it.
Nope.
And it's not considered trade. But I mean, so I mean, the whole thing of trade deficits is primitive and ridiculous. Second, what you're would be looking at trade deficits over a much longer period of time and the impact. The United States has a trade deficit, but we have had high levels of growth, high levels of employment, low levels of unemployment. What's the problem? So this is a bizarre obsession. If you took the whole issue, and then if you really began looking at supply chains, as you and I have played with over the years, the whole thing becomes completely meaningless. So yes, it's an obsession. It doesn't make sense. I have no problem with using tariffs creatively or strategically for a particular purpose, but by and large, this is. What did someone say? This is using a hammer to put in a screw. I mean, or using a hammer to fix a tooth. It doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
So that's, but look at the whole picture of the stuff that moves across borders. It is services. It is non-physical stuff. And that's going to become more and more. What's the biggest supplier now in terms of value to the auto industry, the ICE auto industry? Do you know what it is? It's Google.
No.
Where is Google located? And doing this, and when the auto manufacturer creates the big screens, where does that come from?
And countries have been building competitive advantages. Japan with electronics, in even today, even though a lot of it has moved to China and Korea since. But countries use their abundant resources to develop some form of competitive advantage with regards to other countries. These trade barriers just preclude "quote unquote" fair competition or the success of the "quote unquote" better product. I'll take an example. During the trade agreement between the European Union and Canada, for cheese, local Canadian cheesemakers had a protection for a period, I think it's up to 9 years, and they have not used all this trade protection in order to either lower their costs or move on to these to other markets. It's perplexing.
Well, that's the old infant industries argument. Goes way back to Adam Smith. No problem with that. But they have to be clocked. The infant, you can only have protection for so long, and you should have to check in what you're doing with it. And again, I don't have any problem with that. But there is a more significant issue in the high tech world that we live in. The existence of communities of experts. We have to be in China. We want to have investment there. We want those communities to work. We want to read the articles that the Chinese produce. We want them to read our stuff. That vis-a-vis is terribly important in today's world. And that is really new. And to lose that, to say that we can't invest in China, China can invest, we risk the balkanization of the research communities. Because none of these products are national any longer. I'll tell you an example. I was teaching my course on supply chain, and I was talking about what's the Dutch company that supplies the machines to Taiwan. I forget,
to manufacture the wafers.
I said, look at this. This is not something like a mushroom in the forest just growing up. This machine has supplies that come from all over. If we backtracked and look where the third and fourth. This would be a global thing. We're just thinking, if we think of it as that particular vehicle that comes from the Netherlands company that goes to this particular, that's not a way to look at it. As I say, it's not a mushroom in the forest that comes overnight. This is the product of elaborate supply chain complexity. And what the current Trump view is, we don't understand it, we don't care about it. That really is dangerous, because the world they're talking about of national borders and tariffs does not exist. And if you bring down everything around it, it would be a disaster in terms of advancement of science and so on. So it's just, it's almost unthinkable, yet these people are, what are they drinking? That's really the question I have.
Yes. Well, what are they drinking? Maybe. Let me try something else on you and see how that bounces off. Maybe because the American people are so allergic to taxes, or direct or indirect taxation through VAT or whatever. Is it that tariffs are a way that the Trump administration wants to balance their budget, or is it just that, or is it giving the American people the impression that we're going to make others pay for our government expenses?
The answers to 2 and 3 is yes. They really believe this. I mean, again, tariffs do not contribute money; they take money away. And tariffs are not going to reduce deficit. I mean, the money, it doesn't know that this is fungible. You can take the tariffs, and that's not going to happen at all. And it's just going to make everybody poorer. And that's,
yes.
And in fact, tariffs are very regressive, because people who have to spend more money on daily life spend more, whereas the people who live on larger incomes and financial gains don't. So no, it doesn't make any sense at all. Again, there are things when this is useful, could be useful, but this overall tariffs are not going to solve any problem, big problems.
My last question regarding this is, was it a mistake to let China into the WTO back in the late 90s, early 2000s? Is that where we can trace this quote-unquote original sin of what's happening today?
No.
No.
No. I mean, China played by the rules, not entirely, but having them in the WTO is much better than having them out. What's going to happen if what Mr. Trump is doing, and when he was speaking the other night at the Capitol, the last ones, I was ready for him to hear, and we're leaving the United Nations, and he was at that edge. What's going to happen if the Chinese are smart is that a new wave, the Chinese should say, just get off the Russians. They are useless. And for the Chinese to reach out to Europe and to say, this is the new access, and
yes.
South, and recreate the 1947 world for 2026, but with them as the player, the main move. And there's no reason that shouldn't happen. But to have this thing collapse entirely would be a disaster. And the Chinese involvement in global economy has been far more good than bad. The fact is, China has this incredible resource of this huge consumption market. If you compare it to India, India has lots of richer people in tech, but they didn't create that big middle class in industry making stuff that the Chinese did. And the best thing about that is that these people are consumers, and the Chinese industry works hard. If anyone pushes the Chinese government to be more liberal, more democratic, it's going to be this broad middle class. And yes, when you think of where does that, that's the United States in the 1920s. That's the United States. And people saying, why the hell are they Ford? They're making half the cars in the world. What are they doing? And the fact is, they had that incredible resource of people who were paid enough to buy stuff.
Yes,
and then paid enough to go to colleges. If you look at what the Chinese are turning out in terms of scientists, where did you ever see that before? In the United States, and you had the same criticism made. And so, if you look at the source of a lot of contemporary innovation, comes from China. You have to be there. You have to be part of that, and being there, one hopes, creates more of awareness on their side. Again, I don't think the government in China is very clever about this at the moment, but nonetheless, yes, that was not the beginning of anything bad. That is the beginning of the new world.
Now on to the Canada-U.S. relationship. a fellow called Alain Bauer here in France, a preeminent and well-regarded commentator, says that dictators always need to be listened to as they have a tendency to announce their intentions. Could the USA actually invade Canada and turn it into the 51st state? And if so, why make it only one state and not 13, as we have 10 provinces and 3 territories?
Different questions. Could the United States invade? No. But
why not?
Well, we don't have enough military to do that across the border, no. But more interesting is, from Canadian perspective, if they were the 51st state, you know what they would be? They would be the biggest state. They would have more people in the House of Representatives than any other state except California. California
Yes.
and Canada could run the United States, basically with the New York State. I mean, if you think about it, and 13 would be 26 more senators. They'd run the Senate. I mean, it's bizarre, but if Canada were part of the United States, it would be. And second, the president can't make someone a state. That's a complicated issue to become a state. It wouldn't work. To become a U.S. territory, U.S. colony, no, that's not possible. But it is exceedingly dumb. And you know, what is his buzz on about? Just didn't like Trudeau. What the hell is going on there? Because the Canadians don't bother anybody. I mean, that's the other side of this, for Christ's sake. But I want to get into what you're going to ask me, because I'm going to say a lot of this is the Canadians' fault. At some point, I'm going to talk about that today. But it couldn't happen. I mean, can you imagine Ontario saying we're going to tariff electricity going into the United States? What the fuck does that mean? I mean, the other thing about oil, Canadian petroleum comes from Alberta, as you know. It goes into the Chicago area, into refineries which were particularly geared to that heavy crude. If the Canadian was shut off, those refineries would close. We don't have any heavy crude. To re-gear them would take years, and new pipelines would have to be built, and we'd have to import the heavy crude from somewhere else anyway. I mean, this is not two separate countries, for Christ's sake. This is two sovereign nations sharing a single economic space. And that's the problem of this whole thing. That's what makes it so bizarre. But no, it's just stepping on each other's, like kids pissing on each other's shoes in the schoolyard. It is about as stupid as it could be. I mean,
it is.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is almost beyond stupid.
and if I were to escort you into Mark Carney's, the new Canadian Prime Minister, a former central banker of Canada and of the UK, which to me is always symptoms of very intelligent, very successful people. Whether they're going to be good politicians is another story. But if I was to take you into his office today, what would you tell him?
Don't lose your temper. Just hang on, because he changed it. I think the Canadians behaved about as well as anyone could behave, given the situation. But there's really not much you can do. The trouble is that Canada has, as you know, my feelings, has no other options. Either Canada is a part of North America, or it's adrift somewhere. The idea that Canada can recreate itself as a member of the European Community, or whatever, there's only one way
geography
forward. And what one might hope is that someone like Carney, who is really smart, would encourage a younger group of people to talk about what North America really is, to reach across the border to people and say, and this is what was not done after Newton. You know that. I mean, to talk about how does this place really work? What are we? And because no one knows, the New York Times is still writing automobiles made in Mexico. There are no automobiles made automobiles are assembled in Mexico. But I mean, no one understands this. And perhaps the best that he could do is do what the Canadian government after NAFTA did not do, was encourage people to think about this and talk about it and get an understanding what it is, and to reach across and to build a constituency on both sides of the border that once this storm is over, it's not going to happen again. And that was what they failed to do all along. But that would be the most useful thing, to talk to companies, to get companies to reach out to Washington and tell them how their supply chains work, how this thing really operates, which obviously people in Washington don't know about, but almost no one. I mean, again, when the New York Times makes a mistake like this, then you realize no one knows about it. And so, I mean, that's what it's a pickup. It's a very late in the game to do that, but I would try to get ahead of the game and say, all right, we'll come through this storm, but what can we do to ensure that nothing like this happens again? And the basic thing is for people to understand how this system works. Sovereign nations sharing an economic space. It's not that hard to understand, but I mean, that's la-di-da. You've heard that song before.
Yes, but when I live in France now, and when I look at when I first moved here 24 years ago, I was so excited about this European Union project with its now. I came here just before the euro was quote unquote officially born, and I was thrilled to be a part of this. And then we integrated Hungary and other Eastern European countries, and it was dynamic. It was moving. It was and it was obviously not necessarily always to the best advantage of the rich, quote unquote, rich countries, but still it was going somewhere. And it's now stalled. It's difficult to get it moving again. Same thing with Canada, US, or Canada, US, Mexico. What's the next step in this relationship? In this, as you say, is it some form of common currency? What goes next?
Go back to Europe for the moment. Yes, there have been more difficult, but you still have the euro. You've had more or less Schengen. I mean, bringing the Eastern Europeans in was a brave idea, but there was no choice. Either there was going to be an Iron Curtain, an old Iron Curtain to a new Iron Curtain. There was really no choice. It was and it has been difficult. But if you think of what's the college program, people can go to different schools. Erasmus.
Yes.
I mean, there is a European sense among younger people. There's more on the right in both cases. But by and large, this is not in danger of being torn down. The interesting thing would be in this new situation, whether an actual European arm and European military can be created rather than the patchwork of. That's interesting because that would involve defense industries in different countries collaborating. But I don't think the European situation is as grim as it appears. I think there is a generation of younger people with a right wing, to be sure, that we've never had, rather than a left wing. But I don't. Yes, on the U.S., on the North American side, nothing ever happened. NAFTA was signed, and all three national leaders went home and hid under their desks in the anti-globalization wave that occurred, a battle in Seattle, and no one ever said this was a good. If you look at the Google, there are thousands of articles anti-get NAFTA. None of the governments encouraged research to say what this is all about. All over Europe, there are universities that have European studies program with people more familiar with what's going on. All of Canada, all of Mexico, all the United States, there's not one single program at a business school, for example, dealing with North America. Every Canadian business school has a program on China, but there isn't one on North America. No one knows what this is about. And what happened is that all three national leaders were afraid to say anything. They had it, the minimum, and they said the minimum is fine. All the plans that were made to extend this, to do different things. And perfect example, no one, Ottawa, Washington, Mexico City, knows how an automobile is actually made. The whole supply chain. I mean, you've seen that diagram, that Martin Ray thing that they produced for me, which shows that rear axle, and it has the second tier, and people are amazed. Half the first of all, how much comes in the United States across the one bridge, and then you look; those companies are all headquartered all over the world, and we don't have any idea of this. The tertiary. I mean, drawing that, and I don't like to say I as much, but this I begged the Canadian government to let me set up a program online where every term, people who taught international business could do one piece of this. I'll take this third tier firm and we'll learn as much, and we'll put it online, and we'll build the whole supply chain all the way as far as we can. No one was interested. For the Canadians, Now you know how it's. The concern was sovereignty. If we do anything more, if we say anything, we'll lose our sovereignty. The idea of saying two sovereign nations in a single economic and single region, scary. So the Canadians did not, and if you look at the websites over the years, Canadians were talking about supply chains. They were talking about North American trains, North American, roads. They were talking about cross-border, and then after a couple of months, these would disappear. And if you tried to trace the information, was the only person who was really committed to that, you know who, was my man, Bernard. Bernard Landry was really committed, because Bernard saw the way Quebec could change. It could be the first North American nation. And Bernard learned Spanish. Bernard really, that was his vision for Quebec. It didn't have to leave anything. It would just be in something new. And how could you criticize that? Yes. And that was Bernard's vision. But he's the only one I felt who was really willing to go. And then in public, he was just, Bernard would go crazy and become Quebec nationalist. But Canadians should have realized they had more to gain and more to lose. If they did this, if they took and owned North America. If Canada has really reached out with that wonderful group of people, far better team than the United States, who negotiated NAFTA and kept that team intact and claimed and owned it, because they were the brightest ones. We didn't send the best people. They did all the work. The Mexicans were very good too, but and owned that and got people to study it and had research institutes like you do in Europe, or an Erasmus program where people could go to different. Oh, come on! It could have been done, but the Canadians were so fearful of losing their sovereignty.
Oh well, look at what's knocking on our door right now. Yes.
But it is ironic, because the Canadians could have been on top in North America. I think of the Belgians in many ways, who in the early days of the European Union were the intellectual center. They could have done this. They created it. NAFTA was a Canadian construction more than anything else, because they put the best people. They did the most work on it. At one point, the Canadians complained because the American team was using their briefing book. Well, if you're engaged in an argument with someone and they're using your arguments, you have to realize you're winning.
Yes.
But then the Canadians never looked back and never did anything to make this thing work. I mean, yes. So that's, to make it understood, it worked very well. That's the problem. It worked very well, and people said, we don't have to do anything. Well, we did have to do stuff.
Well, yes. Well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now someone's breaking it, so we'll have to fix it.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It means going back. See, all this has stimulated a very healthy kind of Canadian nationalism. The Liberals may win again. Trudeau put on a good face on all this, and people, he did stand up, and Carney will be fine. As a negotiator, he'll be tough and rational, but what it does is stimulate the kind of Canadian nationalism, which was the problem to begin with.
And I think Carney, with his experience with Brexit, is also going to bring different perspective to all this, and maybe be more attuned to listening to your arguments. We'll see.
I hope so. I mean, it'd be funny. The kind of stuff that we did, the trade guys said it's trade, and I said it's business. And the work we did initially that you read, I'm looking at how companies created North American entities in the 1980s. That was the impetus for all of this. The governments opened the door by lowering tariffs and talking about it, but it was that they looked and they saw this is really a North American entity. The companies have already created this. But, that the trade guys, I always say the trade guys counted the number of boxes going across the border. They never asked what I asked, what's inside the boxes? And that was the important question. I mean, they didn't know what it was all about because no one was interested in business. These guys were trade guys, and I...
Yes.
Yeah. But I hate to say
the raw materials, the machine tools to make them, and now all the electronics and software and AI coming into making all this a reality.
Which can't be tracked as trade anyway. I mean, that's going to be a whole different world. and it's terribly globalized. Not terribly.
This is a Canadian 0 and this is a US 1.
Yes, that's skating. It doesn't work like that. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Blank, for answering these questions at a time of uncertainty and confusion on all of our parts.
Well, as I said, the Canadians have nothing to do but hang on at the moment. But trying to think of the future, what is missing? What is missing is not more Canadian nationalism or Canadian ties to some other countries. It is an understanding of how North America works. And Canada's role should be to build that from the very bottom up now. How does this work? How are we involved in this together? The temptation will be to widen the gap. But hopefully under all this, there will be a commitment. And you think of what the Europeanists did after, in the early days of building a constituency of academics, of intellectuals, of business people who understood this, who spread the word. That has not been, but I think to fight on one side, to resist, but under that, to build this new understanding, because Canada doesn't have another option. It can be poor and remote, or it can be a leader of North America. That's the end. Wow, ends this. Okay.
En guise de conclusion, alors, les voitures électriques chinoises seraient donc le résultat d'une stratégie de pénétration d'un marché mondial de l'automobile très bien pensée, plutôt que celle de manufacturiers traditionnels qui voient le marché des véhicules électriques comme entièrement différent et à pénétrer par le haut, comme pour beaucoup d'innovations numériques des 30 dernières années, exemple Apple et Motorola à une certaine époque. Serait-ce une forme, au contraire, de résistance au changement des marchés et ou des manufacturiers traditionnels ou occidentaux? Ou encore, plutôt, un avantage des économies centralisées et planifiées comme celle de la Chine ou de l'Union soviétique d'autrefois, qui permet de développer une chaîne d'approvisionnement verticalisée, quasi monopolistique, avec des économies d'échelle importantes? Donc, les modèles stratégiques des économies ouvertes et privées se retrouveraient désavantagés dans ce cas-ci, surtout lorsqu'elles sont pilotées par des idéologues mal informés, voire parfois manipulés, face à des concurrents issus d'une économie fermée et planifiée qui a atteint une taille critique. Un mot également sur cette notion de partage d'un espace économique commun que je ne connaissais pas et que je vais explorer, surtout ici en Europe, pour pouvoir en parler avec vous de manière intelligente. Comme d'habitude, les réponses de M. Blank posent de nouvelles questions et nous allons continuer à chercher des réponses auprès des experts, des dirigeants et des académiciens et intellectuels pour vous les faire entendre sur ce podcast. Nous espérons que cet épisode vous a plu. Vous pouvez consulter les notes au www.intelliaconsulting.com/épisode 210. D'ici peu, les notes détaillées et les références complémentaires seront offertes sur la communauté Innovation, Agilité et Excellence Pro, un espace unique où se retrouvent experts, praticiens et passionnés des sujets traités sur ce podcast pour continuer à apprendre, à échanger et à collaborer et développer leur capacité d'action stratégique. D'ici notre prochaine rencontre, nous vous souhaitons une excellente semaine.